everyone, my name is Catherine Tao and I'm the host of the Data Standard Audio Experience. And today we have Micah Melling, the Chief Data Scientist at Americo Financial Life and Annuity. And today we're just going to be speaking about how to ace the data science interview process. So welcome to the show, Micah. I'm very excited to speak with you and just be able to speak more about the interview process for those interested in data science.
Thanks for having me. I am excited to talk about the topic with you today.
So let's just get started. Can you tell the audience more about your background and just what got you into data science?
Sure, that's a great question. I am currently the Chief Data Scientist at Americo Financial Life and Annuity, as you shared just a few moments ago. I've been at Americo for about a year. I work in a number of different departments within the company. So it's a primarily life insurance company, although there are a few different lines of business. So I've helped out with actuary and underwriting work. We also have an investments portfolio. So I work with our investments team on equity trading strategies. I've also worked with our operations team looking at our call center and different operational activities to try to find efficiencies. Prior to joining Americo, I led the data science team at a company called Spring Venture Group, which is a pretty large distributor of Medicare Supplement and Medicare Advantage insurance. So I worked on the marketing and operations side of that business as well. And then prior to that, my first job was with a company called Edelman, which is a pretty good sized marketing and PR firm. And I was in their DC arm and worked on a lot of different marketing campaigns, specifically looking at the efficacy of digital marketing for companies like eBay or Hewlett-Packard, the Business Software Alliance, which was made up of companies like Microsoft. So really had a good foot in the door on data analytics from the start of my career at Edelman. What really got me into data science is I was an economics major in college and really loved it and really was drawn to the statistical side and the econometric side of economics. And as I was thinking about what I wanted to do for a career, I figured out that, in the real world, a lot of the application of statistics and econometrics is data science. And that's really kind of where my passion for it started. And once I got my first job at Edelman, I got more hands-on experience with data science and got some formal education in data science, including a certificate at Georgetown. And then I got a master's in data science at Rockhurst University here in Kansas City. So, I've really just kind of grown for a passion and a love for the field over the last several years because it is so interesting.
Yeah, and that's awesome that you were able to, just from your experiences, know that this is a path that you wanted to take down the data science, data analytics road. And so now I just wanted to talk more about the interview process. So the interview process really starts before the interview actually begins itself. And so you want to start with the resume. And so what are some tips that you have for a strong data science resume?
Sure, that's a really important topic. First of all, if you do a Google search online or talk to teachers or friends, you'll be sure to get some really valid tips for writing a good resume. And of course, following proper formatting and proofreading and ensuring you're being concise and putting impactful lines on your resume, those are all great pieces of advice. I think there are a few nuances for data science resumes. The first of which is don't necessarily be afraid to list something, even if it wasn't a smashing success. In data science, we never bat 1,000. We're going to have projects that don't pan out, and what we need to do from those is learn. And I think data scientists by nature can be tenacious people who understand that, hey, failure happens, and just because something on your resume wasn't a smashing success, you learn from it and you gained experience in that field. So even if you don't have something that you can quantify as a huge success, the fact that you deployed, say, an image recognition system or some type of a machine learning API on the cloud, those are valid experiences, and that can be extrapolated into future projects in your work. One other topic to kind of be aware of on the data science resume is trying to list items that really differentiate you. So for example, sometimes when I'm reviewing resumes of candidates, I will see something like work through the Titanic data set or work through the MNIST data set. And those are great tutorials that I think are very valuable and valid for data scientists early on in their career. However, it's something that probably every data scientist has done. So that's probably not something that is resume worthy. What I would recommend instead is, all right, choose a topic that you're passionate about, whether it's baseball or basketball or census data or music or something along those lines, and carve out a few projects around those. And then that's going to be better food for your resume as opposed to kind of some of these stock analyses that I think everybody has done. So again, kind of the main message here is really think through what makes me different and what makes me unique and try to tell that story on your resume.
Yeah, great insight. I really like how you brought up the idea of thinking of something that you're already interested in, like baseball analytics or just a specific domain that you're interested in, because there's data within almost any industry, really, for you to be able to extract that data and play around with it and just see whatever you can find with it. And just that would be a great, unique project to make you stand out on a resume. So great insight there. And you had also mentioned to me before that you can't always just get a job with your resume alone. Having stuff on your resume, facts and everything like that, it doesn't always make you stand out. So where else can someone spend their time preparing to stand out from other candidates?
Sure. And I think just tacking on what we had talked about is, for example, finding a topic that you're passionate about. For example, a few years ago, I started a baseball data science blog, and I've kept that somewhat active over the last couple of years. I've been pretty busy recently with work and school, but that's a project that when I was searching for jobs, I could point people to that and say, hey, here's a list of blogs that I did, and here's an associated GitHub repo for that. So if you have time, coming up with a focused set of blog posts or GitHub repositories, I think can really be a way to separate yourself. Because again, a lot of these stock tutorials are things that are just going to blend in from the crowd. Kaggle is something that's also an option. They provide data sets and competitions, and you can even list how you scored on some of those competitions. And I think Kaggle is something that's fairly ubiquitous in the data science world. So if you say, hey, I placed in the top N% in this Kaggle competition, that potentially could resonate with the person reviewing your resume and who you're interviewing with. So again, project-based work is going to be important if you have the time. Obviously, if you're working at a job, you will have projects given to you, but outside of work, if you can swing it, or if you're a student, kind of coming up with these projects and working through them in a focused way, I think will really give your background a little bit more heft to it and really help impress the interviewer.
Absolutely. Great insight. And so now I just wanted to transfer over to specific questions that a lot of people are asked on the interview, but a lot of people I think overlook these two questions especially. So I wanted to get your insight of maybe there's a correct way to answer this. So the first question is, tell me about yourself. And then the other one is, why do you want to work here? So there is obviously a right and wrong way to answer these questions, but in your opinion, what is the best way to answer these?
That's a great question, and very relevant because those are questions that are asked in pretty much every interview to some degree or another. When it comes to the quote unquote, tell me about yourself, I think as a data scientist, you want to think beforehand, what are the 3 to 4 projects that I've worked on, whether it's at home, on my personal time, in school, or at a job, that again really differentiate me as a data scientist. And you ideally want to pair that with what the job interviewer is looking for. And depending on how many interviews you've had, you may have more or less information on that topic. But for example, if you know that the job you're applying for has an ML ops component to it, you may want to make sure that you talk about any cloud experience that you have, if you do have relevant cloud experience. So it's thinking through, what are the top 3 or 4 topics that really make me different as a data scientist, and trying to align those with what the job needs. Now, I will say that question can be answered differently depending on who you're talking to. If you're talking to a data scientist, you probably want to give a pretty technical answer to that and potentially talk through some of the nuts and bolts of some of these projects, not necessarily going into 10 minutes of detail, but say, hey, I built an image recognition software program. I used Keras and I used these specific CNN type of architectures, kind of, talking in that really technical language when you're talking to a data scientist up front kind of can really leave a good impression. However, if you're asked, tell me about yourself by somebody from the business, so somebody on the marketing team or the operations team, you can talk about those projects still, but frame it more in terms of business impact, or if the project didn't pan out exactly how you wanted, how you learned from it and how you would use those learnings going forward. I think the big things to avoid when answering that question are, number one, being too brief. So if you gloss through that in 30 seconds, you probably missed an opportunity to share something important about yourself. And then number two, underscoring something that I've mentioned before, is really not trying to tailor the answer to what the business is looking for. Again, that can be somewhat difficult depending on where you're at in the interview process. As you interview more, you'll get more information about what the company is looking for, but trying to tailor that answer, I think, is important as well. And then on that second question, why do you want to work here? I like to turn that into a conversation. So not just giving a generic answer of, hey, you're a respected company, or you're a leader in your field, or something along those lines, but when you're talking to HR or data scientists, you're kind of thinking in the back of your mind, all right, this is what really resonates with me. And it could be something very specific, like this company has a lot of access to really cool data and I want to get my hands on that. Or it could be something like, this is a new team and you expect a lot of people, I'm ready to take on the responsibility. So I think it really comes down to being an active listener through the interview processes, filing those topics in the back of your mind, and then regurgitating them, specifically saying, all right, you have mentioned these three things, and this is specifically why I want to work for this company.
Yeah, I really like those answers for those questions. I think it's something that is often overlooked and people kind of give brief, quick answers on, but I think the interviewers think pretty deeply on the answers for these questions that are asked. So thank you for the insight there. And so I've been asked by a lot of different people interested in the data science field about what is the process like for the interview, because there's a lot that goes on. There's usually multiple interviews that go on. You're talking to sometimes the executives, you're talking to the tech people, the business people throughout the process. Can you just walk us through what is that process like and how many interviews there are, what to expect, how to prepare?
Sure, that's an outstanding question. While it does vary from company to company, I found that there is a general archetype that companies follow for interviewing data science candidates. The first step is sometimes something that you see and something that you don't see. It's something that I actually use when interviewing candidates, just because we get a huge number of applicants and we need to have kind of an initial screener. So that can be the first step in an interview process, is literally just a 3 or 4 question multiple choice test. Maybe there's one free form answer to see if this person can tell up from down in the data science world. Because one unfortunate thing that happens, and it's not specific to data science, is people will embellish their resumes, and you can't always tell exactly somebody's knowledge from a piece of paper alone. So this initial screener question test, typically 3 or 4 questions, can be a way that interviewers kind of weed out some of these people who maybe weren't being the most truthful on their resume. So, piece of advice there is just be ready for an initial screener quiz. It's generally going to be pretty quick, but be prepared for it to be timed as well. So coming out of the gate, just something to be cognizant of. Typically, your next round is a technical interview, and I liken this to passing the bar exam. To become a data scientist at a company, you need to show that you can pass some baseline level of competence, and that comes through a technical phone screen that is typically about 30 minutes in length. And again, the questions vary from company to company, but by and large, you'll see questions around machine learning, statistics, programming, and SQL. And again, depending on the role, there could be some more focused topics on cloud computing or something of the like. These can be pretty difficult. And I know the first couple of times that I did technical interviews, I knew the answers, but they just didn't come out very well. So I got frustrated initially. So one of my pieces of advice would be, hey, your first couple of interviews, don't be too hard on yourselves, because this can be hard and it's a new experience. Your adrenaline is high. You're getting these somewhat difficult questions, and it can take a little bit of practice to get used to it. So if you have friends who are data scientists or who are also interviewing, could be very beneficial to go through some mock interviews with those people. And also could be wise to strategically plan these interviews. So for example, if you have 3 companies that you're really targeting, and one of them you're like, I don't really care or not, if you can, make that your first technical interview as almost a practice round, because if it doesn't go quite as well as you want, you have some practice under your belt before you go to companies 2 and 3, which are targeting a little bit more. One challenging part of these interviews is they can sometimes turn into data science jeopardy, which can be a red flag if you're being interviewed. Because if somebody is wanting you to pull up facts and almost trivia level knowledge, that maybe reflects that this may not be a place that's a great fit for you. So one of the examples I give is a potentially valid question in a technical interview is, explain to me the empirical rule. And so that deals with the normal distribution and basically, how many observations will fall within certain standard deviations of the mean. And if you are able to get the essence of that question, saying that, hey, the empirical rule is something that tells me about the normal distribution and how many observations will fall within a certain standard deviation of the mean. So for example, 99.7% of observations in a normal distribution will fall within 3 standard deviations of the mean. I believe that's correct. I could be misremembering that though. So if you're able to answer just the general gist of that question and understand the purpose of it, and the interviewer is good with that, I think that's a good sign. However, if they don't count it right, unless you actually give the numbers, which is like 67, 95, and 99 points, unless you can remember that directly off your head, then you might be playing Jeopardy. And that could be a bad sign. And as I'm thinking about this, I'm not even sure if I got those numbers correct. They're like approximately correct, but I may not even have gotten those exactly correct, because it's something that if you need it in the real world, you can just look it up on Google. But what's important is if you understand the essence of the questions and not necessarily all of the finer details that you could just Google later on. All right, so there's been an initial screener, a technical phone screen, and then your third step is typically a take-home project. So this is where somebody on the data science team that you're interviewing for will say, hey, here's a data set and a problem we want you to solve. Go build models and send us back some CSV files of your results and your code. And this can be intimidating and this can be hard. One of my advice is to prepare in advance for this. So you should be writing code that is modular and reusable. And if you write code and practice enough, you will say, all right, for any data science problem I'm given, I can throw in my train and my test set into this training function and train it and cross-validate it and evaluate it. So, kind of don't think about these as one-off projects, but think about, all right, before I even interview for these projects, how can I write code and stockpile code that I can reuse for these projects? And as data scientists, we should be doing that anyway. We should be writing code that's object-oriented and can be repurposed over time. One other piece of advice I have to help you stand out is to kind of have a trick or two up your sleeve. So, for example, if you're really interested in model interpretability, you could have some code ready to produce something like SHAP values or use LIME or something along those lines. That may not be something that is required of your project, but it's something that you've prepared for and you've trained for, and you can slip that in really easily in your data science project. So, kind of have one of these like really cool extra things up your sleeve ready to put into your project, because that will help you stand out. And again, if you're preparing in advance for these and writing code and thinking about, all right, how do I write object-oriented reusable code, that shouldn't be too heavy of a lift for you to actually implement. And just also be prepared for 1 or 2 curveballs in these interviews. I know actually for the job that I got at Spring Venture Group, they had some nasty columns in there. Like they had a date column that was like partly in date time format and then partly in epoch time, which was just absolutely nasty to deal with. So be prepared for 1 or 2 curveballs in some of these. But again, I'm kind of a broken record here because I'm very adamant about this topic. We should be writing code on any project that we have that can be repurposed and be modularized for projects in the future. So hypothetically, you could be given 2 or 3 technical exams in a week and reuse code across them to make yourself more efficient. And then lastly, there could be multiple rounds of quote unquote in-person interviews. In the age of the pandemic, those are all online anyway. So who knows when we will see actual in-person interviews again. But these would be, more discussions with your data scientists. There may be some technical questions still in here, but they may be more around problem solving. So for example, how would you solve XYZ problem? Or what infrastructure would you deploy for XYZ problem? And so kind of doing some research on data science architecture and infrastructure and just general problem solving approaches, I think can be particularly useful in these final round interviews, because typically interviewers are not anymore asking you to define what a ROC curve is. It is, how would you go about solving customer churn, or how would you go about predicting the closing price of this equity, or what infrastructure would you prop up for a real-time streaming API or something along those lines. And then you may also talk to members of the business, and this is something we've talked about previously as well. You really want to tailor your answers, not necessarily to be technical, but to speak their language. So if you're talking to somebody in marketing, talk about business impact and how you're curious and like to solve business problems and how you learn and those types of topics as well. So, be prepared to have some more business focused topics and not necessarily just technical topics within kind of these latter rounds of interviews as well. So it is a very involved process. There are a lot of steps involved to it. The data science market is competitive, which I think is kind of brought up some of these rungs of interviews, but with some practice and some preparation, folks should be in good shape to really tackle these interviews. And again, it does take a little bit of practice because it is a slightly different beast, but after a couple of times, people can get pretty comfortable with the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing that interview process. It's often very intimidating for people to go into this because it's just so many rounds and it's a lot of just technical knowledge and speaking with different representatives of the company. So thank you for sharing. And so we've talked about the before the interview, during the interview, and so now I kind of want to talk about the end of the interview. So at the end of the interview, there's usually time for people to kind of ask questions to the interviewer. Is there any specific questions that a person should be asking to kind of gauge the company culture or the team dynamic?
Sure, that's a really good question. First of all, I would recommend having questions prepared in advance. So you always have something to ask during this time. You never want to say, no, I don't have any questions. Another point is you also want to tack on questions that are responsive to different things people have said within the interview. So again, kind of making it a conversation. In terms of specific topics that you might want to ask about how the team collaborates. How many people are on the team? What is their work style? I find that data scientists tend to like to collaborate with one another and to bounce ideas off of one another. So kind of getting a feel for if that type of environment already exists, I think would be really beneficial. And another thing would be, how does the team interact with other business units? So is there a symbiotic relationship? Is the company kind of new to data science and really skeptical of it? Has data science been around a lot? So kind of, asking those types of questions to really get a feel for the relationships that data science has. And then, related to that is also executive sponsorship. So this is something that you would probably figure out pretty early in an interview, but, who is the advocate for the data science team on the executive level? Is that a chief analytics officer? Does the CMO take that role? Is the CEO really involved? Really kind of understanding what the general level of support is around the organization, because if you have people at the top that are advocating for your unit, that can really open up some really neat project opportunities for you and your team. And I think you can also just get a generally good sense for what the company is like by being conversational. Again, that's something that I've mentioned a couple of different times, but you don't necessarily have to plan all of these questions in advance. You can kind of spark up a conversation with people and make it a two-way street as well. So I think, kind of by being a little bit less stilted and formal in some of these settings, you can really connect with people and just naturally figure out the vibe and the culture of the company.
Awesome. And great insight and just great conversation today. And thank you so much for just showing our viewers more about the data science interview process. And so where can our community connect with you and just find you online?
Sure. Probably the best location would be on LinkedIn. To my knowledge, I'm the only Micah Melling out there. So if you just search me on LinkedIn, you should be able to find me.
Awesome. And for more information on the data standard, you can find us at www.datastandard.io. And this episode is sponsored by Pandio. They're a great new tech startup doing things with Apache Pulsar messaging system. So you can learn more about their work at pandio.com. And thank you so much, Micah, for joining us. It was great speaking with you and just learning more about the process. And I hope to talk to you again soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much.